For those of you who don't know me, which there may be 3 or 4 here, I'm Mike Taylor. I was here, not here, but at Fall Creek Falls a year ago to report on some unusual microbiological research in another cave. One of the things, actually all 3 talks today have mentioned unnamed cave number 1, and I'm going to give my mention now, which is Mike Rogers had said he went in it years ago, and there is significant Native American art in there, but he wasn't looking for it. He was just caving and looking at the cave. And I find this is something that happens with us, especially when you are in a cave you haven't been in before. You're looking, where are the formations, what goes, how heavily trafficked is this cave, all of those things. You might see the charcoal on the floor, but we walk right past the piece of art. And it's the same way with biological weirdness, specifically microbiological weirdness. I presented some weirdness a year ago, and then over the course of the last year, several of you have contacted me. And one of those people was Alan Hatcher. Is Alan here today? I haven't seen him. He and Gerald had gone to Davenport Cave, which is in the survey, has been known a long time. It was also on Joe's list for some Native American visitation. And there's a little spot on a boulder, and they recognized it from my slides last year. So we arranged a second trip there in the fall because of an amazing photo Alan took. But anyway, Chuck shot a video of that trip. The audio's not working, so he's not going to play the whole thing.
I'm just going to voice over the whole time. I'll tell you what everyone's saying.
Okay, he's going to narrate. And if you want to see it, it's on YouTube. You can hear it. I'm just as glad he's doing this because the narration is a little goofy, a little naughty, but he can explain. Go ahead and show it.
There's not much to it, so I'll probably cut it short because the majority of this video is kind of based around the banter, but you do get to see the sampling technique that we're using. I'm starting off with this really dramatic drone zoom in. Isn't that awesome? Kind of get some like oohs, ooh, cool. All right. And then we're going to transition into the cave, and what I want you to imagine in your mind that you can't hear right now is Alan Hatcher, Gerald Money, and my wife, Kelly Lewis, who's very funny, all bantering back and forth, while Michael's trying to be serious, and we're not making it easy for him. So here's the blue goo in question, and he's going to stick it in the crack. So you can see where that conversation might go. So this is basically the sampling technique right here. We do this several times. We're just going to iterate this process. So he's sampling blue, he's sampling white, and sampling some yellow oozy goo weirdness. Blue's like not a color you see in nature. So when I saw this, I was super impressed. That probably covers about everything that you really need.
See if you can fast forward to where I wiggled the little white blobby thing.
Okay.
Look at this blobby thing. This is something else you probably haven't seen in caves.
Look at that. Let's watch that again. Instant replay.
In a science fiction movie, I would already be an alien from having touched that.
Enhance.
Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about today is the blue goo and its connection to secret squirrel.
Were there macroinvertebrates in that water?
Not in the water, not that we saw. Of course, there could have been some very small invertebrates that we missed, but it's a tiny little pool. The boulder sits up about this high. There's charcoal around the boulder. Clearly, Native Americans would stop there probably because the water source seems continual. It's going drip, drip, drip from the ceiling all the time. But the area of interest, it's a little blue area, and then it kind of drips down the rock and makes some flowstone, gooey-looking flowstone down the rock. And really, we don't know where the water's coming from. We don't know where the water goes. It's a fairly dry cave. By way of introduction to this, and I don't guess I will need the microphone, I am by day a mild-mannered journalist. I write cave books, I write cave stories, I teach journalism. I'm not a scientist, but my alter ego is a vigilante microbiologist, and I have something to show here. A, my diet has not succeeded. But B, I am a member of the Secret Squirrel Science Club. And we've been around since about 2018. I tell the story of how this cave, which many of you know is not in the TCS at Secret Squirrel, that's one entrance of a known cave. The landowner is very particular, and I swore that if I could do this science, I would never say the name in public, but if you know it, you probably know it. But anyway, I wrote about it in this 2020 book, Hidden Nature, which I considered my love story to tag. Other people have called it a love letter to Marion Smith. If it is, alas, it's unrequited love. But it's also a love letter to Gerald Boney and Joe Douglas and Kristen Bobo and Lee Pearson, Alan Crabtree, a bunch of other people who you all know. And one of the things I discovered through Joel Buckner is something I had seen in Western caves. And let me go ahead and get to my slides to explain how that relates to this new discovery. Let's get out of this. That one. Okay, that is not the presentation, but we can.
Have we learned anything yet? How do we do this?
I've only been doing this at school for like 20 years, and I still. Slideshow.
I need to.
I had it set as a show, so it would jump right into it, and of course that's not what I put on this computer.
All right,
okay.
we got to do the thing though.
3 dots there.
I don't have. Here we go. Here are 3 dots and display settings. Is it that? Yeah, that's got it. So.
Okay, so this is a line plot of AKA Secret Squirrel Cave. I talked about all this last year. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. But it's a multi-level system. Current map length, I think, is a little over 12 miles, but there's new passage to be added to that map. And there is a perched pool above the main stream level that's called the Petroleum Passage because of its odd smell. And it has these black, sometimes bluish patches on the floor of this long, narrow passage. Typically, it has perched water sitting in it. It's got a lot of small salamanders, and at times, different cavers who are mapping the system have reported hundreds of salamanders in this area, thousands of millipedes in this area, a lot of juveniles there. And it's so far back in the cave, at least in terms of the known entrance, that it's odd that there are so many back there. And one of our theories is they may be, the insects may be feeding at base level off of whatever's in these orange and white bands around the black stuff. Well, what is it? I first got an eye for this stuff by caving in Lechuguilla, and especially by assisting microbiologists. As you may know, Lechuguilla is just loaded with gypsum and selenite and unusual crystals. It seems to be a hypogenically produced cave, meaning rising sulfurous spring water rather than meteoric rainwater carved its passages, and microbial action helped dissolve the limestone, created some of the acid, and all of the gypsum and manganese seems to be remnants of that microbial action, and the descendants of those hot spring microbes seem to still live in the walls. And so I've gone on several trips back in the 90s with Diane Northup as just one of her microbe Sherpas. And so I took an amateur class in microbiology, just listening to her talk on those trips. And then I went with her and Louise Hose and Penny Boston to Villa Luz in Mexico, where they famously have the snotite formations. Villa Luz, like Lechuguilla, sits above a known petroleum reservoir, not far from areas with active oil wells. And the snotites in Villa Luz, they're colonies with hundreds of species of fungi, bacteria, archaea, all these organisms. And as a colony, they consume sulfur and other minerals in the wall, and they produce acid. And every little drop on these wiggly soda straws is a drop of acid that we repeatedly measured at 0.0 pH. It felt like a cigarette burn if it touched your skin and you wanted to get it off right away. I learned about Moville Cave in Romania, which becomes relevant in a minute. Its microbial ecosystem, the atmosphere of Moville is highly sulfurous. It's poisonous to humans. Nobody gets in there unless they're wearing oxygen. And the entrance is underwater, so people wear their dive gear in the dry part of the cave. And there are hundreds of species that have been identified there, all of them eating off of a food chain that at its root is microbial. And so here we are back in Secret Squirrel. Some of the things that we have found as a group, I'm working with a biologist at my university for the words that are too long that I don't understand. They're all his domain. But more importantly, he has a DNA lab and some really smart undergraduate students who have been analyzing samples. We've done so far a total of only 3 collections in the cave. Most of this data is just from one collection. I'm going to share a little bit of new stuff from this cave and the Blue Goo in a minute. But there's a lot of evidence for chemo-autolithotrophic activity, and that just means bugs that eat rocks. And the bugs that eat rocks are the ones that can help create new cave passages because they are actually dissolving limestone as they go. Now in Tennessee, that's highly unusual. And there's lots and lots of this cave system that look like any other cave in the Highland Rim. So we're not saying the whole cave was formed, as Lechuguilla may have been, by deep underwater hot springs thousands of years ago, but there are some parts of the cave where the same sort of actions seem to have been creating, selenite formations similar to Lechuguilla, just a little smaller. One of our students took this one, I believe, unless Hal may have taken that one. Hal took that one. But anyway, there's lots of evidence for these unusual microbes similar to what's been found out west. There's also the petroleum itself. This is not pollution. It's in a wilderness area. There's no roads, no buildings, no old buildings, no nothing. And these are some chemical analyses of individual molecules. On the bottom is typical native petroleum like you would get in oil wells in Kentucky, northern Arkansas. Not real high quality oil like you get in Texas, kind of degraded oil, but even so the carbon change, which form these spikes in the analysis, they're very long, about 14 carbons. These up here on the top, they're very short, 4 or 5 carbon chains, molecules, and you chemists can correct me. I know as much about chemistry as I do biology, which is just enough to get into trouble. But as I understand it, the only way you're going to find petroleum like this in nature is if something has been actively degrading it for a long period of time. And we think it's the microbes that are actively degrading it. In fact, we found particular species that are already in use commercially in other places for oil spills. This was a sampling trip in December with our students. We're trying to get more advanced samples, not just in the petroleum patches, but in the general area. There's water sampling going on, and actually that's a small petroleum patch that she's sampling. We're doing pH tests on the water, air samples above the water, and measuring water temperature to see if there's any warm water in the cave, which there's not, but it's part of what's confusing about this. We also did soil samples, and there's only been a little bit of analysis of those soil samples, but these 3 images on the left are all organisms that are in the soil around the vents, cave ant beetle, a wing that's not identified. There's a couple of guesses from Dr. Ingman. A cave-adapted millipede, one of lots and lots that you find in the pool. And then an adult cave salamander. As I say, there are a lot of salamanders around the petroleum area, more than the whole cave has salamanders, but more than you see elsewhere in the cave. These are some of the analyses from our 2019 testing that I talked about last year, so I'm not going to read all that stuff. I'm just going to summarize. Organisms that we are finding are about 600 in the mini vents in Secret Squirrel. Some of those organisms are closely related to those found at hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean. They're also closely related to microbial mats from Yellowstone hot springs and places like that. Yet the temperature is normal Tennessee cave temperature. If you've been to Yellowstone, you've seen bands like this around the large hot springs in Yellowstone. That's what we first thought of. That's when I first saw one of these in a photo. That's why I said we need to go sample there. And yet, again, there is no thermal water associated with this cave. Well, so here's the blue goo, and this is from our sampling trip in October. And you can see some of the similarities. Blue, and in this case, this looks like rock, but the sponge, that's the scientific term all around it, this is a cottage cheese-like yellow substance, as yet unidentified. And then the white area, you saw the little, the blobby stuff we were sampling. And we're trying to understand the relationship. And this is about 5 miles as the crow flies from this other pool. So they are geologically nearby each other. Since then, there's also another cave which is seldom visited. It has multi-drop low stream level. In the report that I've gotten via email from Gerald and others is that there's multiple petroleum pools with a strong stench of petroleum in the area. How long would you say that passage length is?
I really don't know.
Josh, is Josh still here?
That area of the cave, maybe 1,000 feet back.
1,000 feet back, and what is the length of the smelly part?
It just depends on, I mean, some days during heavy rain, it's throughout the entire.
Right. So and this is, the blue goo is about 5 miles south as the crow flies. This location is about 5 miles east as the crow flies, all again in the same general area. We have not sampled at all in this area. It's harder to access, and we're sort of holding it back as a pristine test site once we get better theories about the first 2 sites we have. But I've also been told about a site in northern Alabama, possibly 2 sites in northern Alabama, that likewise have the blackish blue, the yellowish, and a petroleum smell when you're close to it. This one in Alabama washes out periodically with flooding, but then reestablishes later, so it's not always there. So the big questions that this has raised: 1, how did it get there? We keep finding organisms associated with extremophiles from all over the world, but deep, hot places, not cool, damp places like we're used to. Also, we've got organisms that are associated with acidic pools in Antarctic dry valleys. Again, not what you'd find in Tennessee, not found anywhere else but those places. And what does it mean that it's here in Tennessee? And so over the last year, actually beginning at this meeting a year ago, I left this meeting and drove to Nashville, where I met Hal Love and Ben Miller. We're sitting out on Ben's deck, drinking cold beer and talking about caves. And I had wanted to ask Ben, how did this stuff get here in a geologic sense? And his answer was, I don't know. But anyway, I was asking him about our first theory, and to make them easy to remember, I gave them names. Theory number 1 is Jed Clampett. For those younger people in the audience, he was a Beverly hillbilly, just a poor mountain man, barely kept his family fed until he was shooting up some food, and up through the ground came bubbling crude. A very, very loose Hollywood adaptation of the fact that there are producing oil wells, or there used to be in eastern Tennessee, Kentucky, other areas. But there's problems with that. The typical high production oil well is very deep. It goes well below the limestone layers where we find our caves. And so if there is an oil-rich area, besides chemically it would look different, it would have to have a mechanism to bring it up from the depths. And that's what Ben was saying. There's a definite rift that runs through Secret Squirrel Cave, and the rift could extend down very deeply. But even so, there's not a good mechanism to transport it to the surface. So that led me to theory number 2, which I called Jeff Goldblum, who famously said in Jurassic Park, "Life will find a way." And what he was talking about was the power of evolution in the natural world, which started with this guy with the beard here, who in 1835, and I'll tie this in a few moments, he went on that little boat down there to the Galapagos. Voyage of the Beagle is his first book from it. I highly recommend it as an adventure book. He was much younger then, obviously. But what he noticed were that the lizards and other native life of each of these islands were quite a bit different from each other. And this is where we begin to get the idea of island biodiversity and the fact that isolated populations can chug along for long periods of time and change and adapt to the surroundings in which they find themselves without interacting necessarily with the outside world. And he famously wrote about these islands 30 years after his voyage in The Origin of Species. And then about 10 or 12 years after that, the fact that all these organisms seem to be evolving together got him wondering about the start. And he wrote in a famous letter, which this is a photocopied facsimile of, to his friend Joe Hooker, what if it all started in a warm little pond somewhere with just the right chemical circumstances to give birth to life? Now that theory's been hard to prove because nobody has succeeded in creating such a warm little pond in the lab. But we are, in science over the last 20 years, looking at a lot of warm little ponds. In places like hot springs with what they call extremophiles, life where no other life could really live at high temperatures. One of the commercial benefits from these high temperature organisms is Kerry Mullis, a surfer who was also a chemist, was driving late at night on the Pacific Coast Highway and trying not to run off the road. When it suddenly hit him, he could make fast DNA reproductions without destroying the protein that let him do these reproductions if he stole a protein from these hot spring organisms. And that's why we have DNA testing today. That's why you can go find out who your ancestors were, what kind of breed your dog is descended from, was because Kerry Mullis realized these hot spring organisms had a unique property that made them very, very easy to replicate DNA. And that started a lot of DNA replication and testing. This guy Ballard here, famous for finding the Titanic and the research submersible Alvin, was the first, not far from where Darwin found the lizards, in the Galapagos Trench, a deep sea trench in the islands with hot water. He called them black smokers, which we still call them today. And it turns out the microbes shooting up at heat from great depths support all these life forms, the weird tube worms and crabs and shrimp that have adapted over time to just this food source. They are pretty well independent of the photosynthetic food chain. They're getting their food from deep underground, not from sunlight. Well, we understand a lot more thanks to another caver, a guy named Norm Pace, who I know a few cavers who have been on the cover of National Geographic. He's the only one I know who's been on the cover of Nature. And he used that finding of Kerry Mullis to work with a professor of his and create a new tree of life. We used to talk about 5 kingdoms of life in all my son's biology class 20 years ago. That's in the textbook. But we know that most of those kingdoms are on but one domain, and we really have 3 domains of life, and their origin, the root, is somewhere in a deep hot spring right here in the center. And the 3 domains are eukarya, which are multicellular organisms like us and corn and your dog, but also all the fungi, all the mushrooms, they're more closely related to humans than any bacteria. And the most ancient of the organisms are the archaea. And what I want to point out is some of these genus and order lines here. I'm not sure what level lines these are in the classification of things, but at least half of them are in the secret squirrel site, and even more than half are in the blue goose site. We have a lot of archaea. We have a lot of very ancient organisms. They don't only live in hot springs. There are some archaea that do very well in any area with no oxygen. So in your gut, when you're digesting things, there's archaea helping that process because they've adapted to the acidic, oxygen-free area of mammalian guts, and also insect guts. But anyway, there's definitely archaea going on. So I asked a geologist I know, actually as a result of the Blue Goo trip, one of the cavers suggested, well, there is some petroleum in the Chattanooga Shale, and I wanted to understand the relationship of that Chattanooga Shale to our test sites. And so here's what Chuck came up with. I'm going to turn it over to him.
You guys all know the stratigraphic column. I don't need to go over any of this, right? We're good. This is an area of Short Mountain, so I stole a stratigraphic column I made for a map of Short Mountain, which is why you're seeing the Cumberland Plateau here. We're not worried about that. Look at the Eastern Highland Rim, and look at the very bottom of it. We have the Fort Payne Formation and Chattanooga Shale. This is relevant for the next slide. I can't divorce those two on geologic maps. If I could, that'd be super cool, but I'd have to go out and map it personally. Underneath that, we've got the Leapers-Cathys Formation and the Big Buchanan. Those are the two rock units that these caves we're talking about are in. One of them is in the Leapers-Cathys, and then two of them that I know, that I've done some mapping for, are in the Big Buchanan. And so the relationship here is that the Chattanooga Shale is on top of this. Like this is layer cake geology. We've got, all these layers sequentially on top of each other, generally flat, in varying thicknesses. And so there are places where the Chattanooga Shale is immediately on top of these particular caves. So generalized cave density is the red. Our Chattanooga Shale Fort Payne outcrop is in the blue. And then I have provided generalized study area. So you have this very heavily dissected, this is Nashville Basin geography primarily, and you can see a peak over here on the right side, this little island, that Short Mountain for context, that rises all the way up through the two physiographic provinces above the Nashville Basin. But we've got this very dissected mass of rock that's coming out over the hills.
Okay. And so across the southeast, the Chattanooga Shale is a known petroleum source. Some of those hillbilly mountain wells that are 100 miles away from our study area are in the Chattanooga Shale. In my state, Arkansas, up in the Ozarks, there are a few working wells in the Chattanooga Shale. But in those locations, it's a much thicker strata than it is. You can see how desiccated and eroded it is in the Tennessee Basin. But there are remnants of it, and those remnants tend to be not very thick. There was someone on our trip to the Blue Goo who knew how thick it was immediately over Davenport Cave. Gerald, do you remember that? I don't remember who it was. We had several people on that trip. About 15 to 20 feet. So obviously not that thick, and obviously broken in places, and obviously something that water can flow through and flow downward. And as you remember, I said in the Blue Goo pool, we have this constantly shifting deposit from a drip in the ceiling that we don't know the source of. The water in Secret Squirrel floods when we have flooding events around here. In fact, in December, it was quite high from some of the recent rains in the overflow passage. But the infeeders for that are not well known or well understood. There are probably other entrances yet to be found that may be below some of these deposits. So anyway, here's my Jeff Goldblum theory. Some of you may recognize that this is continental drift over the millennia. And right here in the second row, we've got early Devonian. The Chattanooga Shale is a late Devonian, so 400 million years ago, maybe a little bit earlier than that. But you go through the carbon. At that point, the area where Tennessee is was sea bottom, and this was a seabed formation, just like the limestone layers we go caving in. And there were probably, like there are most sea bottoms we know of now in present day Earth, which is here on the third row, or fourth row rather, there are lots of these deep deposits near rift separation sites where the continentals are drifting away from one another. Anyway, during all this moving around, that Chattanooga Shale went up and down several times, inundated several times, later formations laid on top of it, until we finally get down to today, where it is more or less in the middle of North America. And what I'm hypothesizing, keep in mind, this is a journalist's hypothesis yet to be tested by geologists or biologists, is that there are isolated pockets of microbial activity associated with that petroleum throughout the Chattanooga Shale. And one other thing that's important, let me jump ahead a little. This is the classification. And when we do the DNA extraction, when the students extract, it's about a 4-hour process. When we get those little pokey samples from the crack, they extract the DNA, we ship it off to a lab in Texas. They take, because we're a small school and these are small samples, they wait till they have like a $40,000 sample run from Colorado University or someplace like that. They tack us onto the end, and we come back with identification by domain, the 3 branches: kingdom, phylum, class, order, and family. About 560 of our organisms we can identify by genus, only a handful by species. So by genus, we got all these organisms that are close relatives to things that have only been found in deep sea vents or Antarctica or a few extreme places elsewhere on Earth. And we don't see those extreme conditions in our study area. So what we think is these are their cousins that moved to Tennessee. You know, they have stayed in these little pockets of migrating oil, housed continually in the same rock unit since they were deposited close to 400 million years ago. They're as closely related to what those ancient organisms are as we are to our ancient ancestors millions of years ago. But there are still genetically recognizable traits elsewhere in the world. And the first place these ancient archaea were found were in those black smokers starting in 1979. It's a new science. In the 1990s is when a lot of the organisms in Lechuguilla were found. In the 2000s is where some other places, Mobile Cave, etc., were found. And I mentioned Mobile Cave because one of our archaea at the genus level has only been found one other place, and it's in Mobile Cave, and it's in the guts of some of those pseudoscorpions that live in the poison gas and eat the sponge on the surface of the pool. And that is from the blue part of the blue goo sample. I'm going to read just a little bit of a summary that I got yesterday. We just got the results of that, even though it was in October. The results came in 2 weeks ago, and my biologist partner, Jamie's been analyzing them, and he sent me about 2 pages of analysis. But let's see, quite abundant in all of the blue glue samples is an unidentified species of Tepidbacter. It's a gram-positive bacteria in the family Crastidaceae. It's a moderately thermophilic bacteria species isolated from deep sea hydrothermal vents. And there's other species within the genus that have been identified. One is isolated from a soil polluted by crude oil, and one is from a bacterium that had consumed it in a deep sea hydrothermal vent where the bacteria was actually fermenting these organisms as part of its food source. So there's a lot of indication that we have distant cousins in these extreme locations, but we are something different here in Tennessee. And so the ongoing research is going to be to test this by better analyzing the oil itself and also by hitting these multiple locations. And that's why I wanted to talk about the same subject a year later, is if you see weird blue stuff or blobby yellow stuff, or if you smell petroleum, make a note of where it is in what cave and shoot me an email. We've got at least 3 more sites to look at now, and I have a feeling just like Native American art, once we started looking for it, we saw it everywhere, and suddenly there were 50, 60 unnamed caves. I think there's a lot more of this going on that none of us have thought to look at before, but we'll get a clearer picture when we see it. And if every place we find it, it is below the Chattanooga Shale, then I think it's stuff leaking out of a very old refrigerator. At least that's my theory. One last thought. These are 2 photos here. The bigger one, Alan Hatcher sent me, and look, this looks like a sci-fi city from a movie or something. This white stuff seems to be amoebas, which are not hydrothermic organisms, and they're amoebas that are a relative of soil amoebas, but we think these soil amoebas, which is why they're so gooey, are somehow consuming material from the blue organisms, which are more the thermophilic organisms. And then the yellow stuff there's about 600 species or genus level differentiations. Operational taxonomical units is what we call them, not species. About 600 in the blue stuff, about 500 in the yellow stuff, and about 200 in the white stuff, and only a little crossover between them. So there's obviously a lot to understand. Plus, surface water, floods, other activities cause changes. This is the same spot, slightly different orientation. This on the side here is the top here. But you can see the layout of organisms has changed, and what was the big circle of blue in the summer, by the fall, was this yellow deposit, and there were new blue patches elsewhere. So these are very dynamic, active, constantly evolving systems. One of the things we want to do in the future at our original Secret Squirrel site, because it's seldom visited, is build a very small removable platform and put time-lapse photography on it. We right now are trying a time-lapse camera the students put in December, which I forget the frequency, but every once in a while it flashes infrared light and takes a photo. And we're hoping it'll last 3 to 4 months before the battery runs out, and then we'll go pull it out pretty soon. But anyway, there's a lot to learn. It's very strange. It's very small. I don't know what it means for the world at large, but I've become kind of obsessed with it. Thank you.